Stop right there. Don't move.
What is happening?
Why are you out here right now?
I'm running. I live nearby.
What's the reason for the stop? You match a description.
A description of what? I'm in running clothes. Just a person.
Keep your hands where I can see them.
The patrol cars came in fast and tight, like they were closing a net. Tomas Griff was still in running clothes, sweat on his forehead, phone in his hand, and a deputy was already telling him to stay right where he was while another unit rolled up behind him. Tomas kept his posture steady and his hands visible, but the scene around him kept growing. More lights, more doors opening, more deputies looking at him like he had already done something. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell people where you're watching from in the comments. State, city, even country. And if you watch stories about real-world accountability, power plays, and people staying calm when the system gets it wrong, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now rewind, because this didn't start with Tomas doing anything illegal. It started with a call. Deltona, Florida. Suburban streets, quiet blocks, the kind of neighborhood where people notice anything unfamiliar and treat it like a problem. Deputies were responding to a reported burglary. A witness had called it in, and dispatch pushed out a description. The problem was the description was the kind that causes trouble. Vague, inconsistent, and easy to force under the first person who matched the broadest parts of it. And Tomas, a black man out for a run, ended up in the path of that match. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running away from anything. He was literally running the way runners do. Steady pace, focused, moving through his route. He had a life that didn't fit the story the deputies were arriving with. He owned property nearby. He knew the area. He was the kind of person who handled details because he had learned the hard way that details were what kept situations from spinning out. That mattered because the deputies didn't arrive looking for clarity. They arrived looking for control. When they spotted Tomas, they didn't approach like he was a runner who might have seen something. They approached like he was the suspect. Tomas noticed it immediately. The spacing of the cars, the way they boxed him off the street, the way they positioned themselves to cut off movement, the way no one started with basic questions meant to confirm identity in a normal, calm way. Tomas stayed calm anyway. He told them who he was. He explained that he was out for a run. He offered identification early, before anyone had to demand it. He tried to do everything people are told to do in these moments. But that is where the power chess game started. Because even when a person cooperates, a stop like this can still become a detention if the officers decide they need a hold while they figure things out. And that's the danger zone. That's where vague descriptions and pressure from higher-ups turn into extra units, longer waits, and more aggressive posture. Tomas handed over ID. He explained he owned property nearby and could prove it. He pointed out he had nothing to hide because he was live streaming the whole thing on his phone. He said it clearly, not as a threat, but as a fact. Everything was being recorded. That detail changed the temperature. Some deputies got more careful right away. Others got more irritated. You could see it in their body language. Recording removes the ability to rewrite what happened later. It makes people choose their words differently. It forces everyone to act like they might have to explain themselves. Even with that, the scene kept tightening. A deputy kept Tomas in place and made it clear he was not free to just continue his run. Another deputy moved around him, scanning him like they were looking for something that wasn't there. Tomas stayed polite, but he also stayed firm. He didn't get loud, he didn't panic, he didn't make sudden moves. He did everything right. And still, the deputies treated him like everything right was suspicious. Tomas asked what the description actually was. The answers he got didn't line up cleanly. One detail would be mentioned, then another would contradict it. The direction of travel didn't make sense with where Tomas was found. Clothing details were shaky. Even the confidence level behind the words sounded thin, like they were leaning on close enough. That's the thing about these situations. Close enough becomes a trap, because the deputies were not just responding to a call. They were responding to expectations. A burglary call creates adrenaline. It creates a need to show action. It creates a feeling that letting the wrong person walk away would be a failure. And when that mindset takes over, every calm explanation from an innocent person starts being treated as a story that needs to be tested. Tomas kept answering. He kept presenting proof. He kept his voice measured, and then one deputy, the one who seemed less aggressive than the others, started acting like he was trying to keep the situation from getting worse. That deputy didn't say Tomas was under arrest, but he also didn't treat him like a free citizen. He gave the vibe of someone stuck in the middle, someone who didn't fully believe Tomas was the suspect, but also didn't want to challenge the chain of command in front of everyone. Tomas could tell. And viewers could tell, too, because the deputy's behavior didn't match the level of force being applied. The deputy kept signaling that Tomas just needed to wait, that it would be sorted out, that nobody wanted anything bad to happen. Tomas didn't take comfort in that because he knew what the situation looked like from the outside. A black man boxed in by multiple patrol cars while deputies checked his story. That's not reassurance. That's risk. At one point, the deputy admitted something important. The pressure wasn't coming from evidence in front of them. It was coming from above. A sergeant was pushing the stop forward. The message was basically to hold Tomas until they could be sure. That's when Tomas did what more people wish they could do in these moments. He didn't explode, but he did name the pattern. He pointed out that the treatment didn't match the facts. He pointed out how quickly they moved from checking to detaining. He pointed out how often fit the description becomes a shortcut that turns black men into default suspects. And he kept it grounded, not emotional. He didn't have to yell. The scene was loud enough. The deputy responded the way people often respond when they don't want to face what's happening. He kept insisting it wasn't about race. He tried to make it sound like procedure, like everyone would get the same treatment. But right there in real time, Tomas was proving the opposite. Because the deputies weren't working from solid information. They were working from a vague description and the assumption that the runner they stopped could be the guy. And once that assumption is in place, everything Tomas did got filtered through it. His calmness became too calm. His proof became too ready. His phone became a problem. Even the fact that he owned property nearby became something they wanted to verify, like it was an unlikely claim instead of a normal fact. That's the chess move the system uses. Make normal things sound suspicious, then act like detention is the responsible choice. While this was happening, the neighborhood was watching. People came out. A woman nearby noticed the setup and started paying attention because the scene didn't match the story of a dangerous burglary suspect. Tomas wasn't acting like someone who had just broken into a home. He was acting like someone who had just been stopped for existing. The deputy's tone shifted again because now it wasn't just Tomas's live stream. It was the public. And that creates another kind of pressure, one the department can't control. Still, nobody was ready to admit the obvious. They didn't actually have enough to justify what they were doing. So they did what departments do in that moment. They stalled. They kept Tomas there. They made calls. They waited for confirmation. They repeated the same phrases, just doing their job, just checking, just making sure. Tomas asked what was taking so long because the longer detention drags out, the more it becomes its own punishment. It interrupts your day, it humiliates you, it marks you in front of strangers, and it sends the message that your freedom depends on whether someone feels like believing you. The deputy kept telling Tomas that it would be fine and that it wasn't going to go anywhere serious. He kept circling back to the same reassurance, but he also kept circling back to the same excuse. They needed to confirm. And the confirmation they needed wasn't coming from facts at the scene. It was coming from somewhere else, someone getting a clearer image from a witness or a video. The longer Tomas stood there, the more the stop stopped being about a burglary and started being about control. The deputies kept him boxed in on the roadside like they were freezing time until someone else could solve their uncertainty for them. Cars stayed positioned to limit movement. One deputy kept a steady watch on Tomas's hands and waist, like he was expecting a sudden change. Another stayed near the patrol car, working the radio, waiting for something, anything, that would justify how big the response had gotten. Tomas didn't give them a single excuse to escalate. He stayed still. He kept his phone up. He kept his voice level. He repeated the same basic facts: who he was, where he lived, why he was there, and that he could prove his connection to the area. He didn't argue about authority. He argued about logic. And that's when the power chess really showed itself. Because once an officer decides someone is a possible suspect, the goal quietly shifts. It's no longer figure out what happened. It becomes don't look wrong. So the deputies leaned into stalling tactics. They didn't accuse Tomas directly, but they also didn't treat him like a regular person who had been temporarily questioned. They held him in that gray zone where the citizen has all the limits of detention without the clarity of an arrest. Tomas kept asking for the description details, and the more it came out, the messier it sounded. It wasn't a clean match. It wasn't even close. The suspect description kept wobbling. Clothing details that didn't match a runner, physical details that changed depending on who was speaking, and direction of travel that didn't line up with where Tomas had been stopped. It was the kind of description that could describe half the county if you said it fast enough. But instead of admitting the description was weak, the deputies treated the weakness like a reason to hold Tomas longer. That's the trick. When the information is vague, enforcement fills the gaps with suspicion. Tomas didn't raise his voice, but he did tighten his boundaries. He explained clearly that he was being treated like a suspect without solid information. He said the stop felt like it was happening because he was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said it in a way that didn't invite debate, more like a statement of reality. A nearby neighbor had fully locked in by then. People were watching from driveways and porches. At least one person was recording too. And Tomas's live stream meant none of this could be cleaned up later with a rewritten narrative. That's when Deputy Rourke, the one who seemed stuck between sides, kept trying to soften it. He kept insisting it wasn't about race. He kept trying to sell procedure. He kept trying to calm Thomas down even though Thomas was already calm. And that right there was the tell. When someone is already calm and you keep telling them to calm down, it's not about their behavior. It's about making them smaller. Tomas didn't take the bait. He didn't turn it into a yelling match. He kept it tight and factual. He pointed out that he had done everything asked of him. He had given ID. He had explained his presence. He had offered proof. He had stayed respectful. And still he was being surrounded like he was dangerous. The deputy responded with more reassurance, and Tomas responded by continuing to document. This part matters because it's where most situations like this go wrong. Not because the innocent person gets aggressive, but because officers get impatient. They start treating the person's dignity as defiance. They start using tone as justification. They start stacking little claims to build a reason to do more. But Tomas never gave them the emotional reaction they were used to controlling. And that forced the deputies to rely on the one thing they couldn't manipulate: actual identification from the witness. Eventually, word came through that they were getting a clearer image from someone who had seen the suspect more directly. A video still, a better look. Something concrete. And for the first time, the deputy's confidence shifted into hesitation. The body language changed. Less chest-forward energy, less "we got him." More side glances between deputies. More radio checking. More waiting for the final piece to save face. Then it came in. A clearer image reached them, and it didn't match Tomas. Not the face, not the build, not the clothes, not the person. The entire reason they were holding Tomas evaporated in a second. And you could see how fast the system flips when it realizes it's wrong. The deputies backed off the intensity almost immediately. The stance loosened. The tone softened. The talk became polite. The same people who had treated Tomas like a threat started treating him like a misunderstanding. Apologies followed. Not the kind that fully owned the harm, the kind that tried to smooth it over. They said they were just responding to a call. They said they had to check. They said it was an overreaction. They said sorry for the inconvenience. Tomas accepted the reality without absorbing the blame. He didn't celebrate. He didn't insult them. He didn't explode. He did something more effective. He made it plain that the problem wasn't one deputy's attitude. The problem was the entire process that allowed a vague description to turn into a multi-card detention of an innocent man. And he ended it with a line that stuck because it was simple and accurate. He said they hadn't stopped him because they knew. They stopped him because they guessed. That was the moment the deputies couldn't argue with, because the video proved it. They released him. Tomas kept walking away under his own control, phone still recording, still steady. He didn't run off like someone afraid. He left like someone who understood he had just survived a system that can decide your reality for you. But the story didn't end on that street. Because once the live stream and bystander recordings hit the internet, the stop stopped being an internal matter. It became public evidence. By the time Tomas got back to his route, the stop was already turning into something bigger than one bad call. Because Tomas hadn't just been detained. He had been detained on camera in a way that showed every step of the process. Vague description, aggressive posture, multiple units, long delay, and then the instant flip when the evidence finally showed they had the wrong person. That's why it spread. Clips from his live stream started circulating first. Then the bystander footage added a second angle that made it harder for anyone to claim the camera missed context. People could see Tomas's demeanor. They could see his hands. They could see that he wasn't acting like someone who had just committed a burglary. They could also see how many patrol cars were involved for what was supposed to be a quick verification. The comments weren't confused about what happened. A lot of people focused on the same pattern. The deputy kept insisting it wasn't a race thing. But the only reason Tomas became the center of a burglary response was because he was a black man who vaguely matched an inconsistent description. People pointed out the logic trap, how the system can treat someone as suspicious first and then look for justification later. In the days after, the department's response followed a predictable path. There was no big, direct ownership of harm. There was no immediate public apology that matched the seriousness of the stop. Instead, it was framed like a normal, reasonable action based on a call for service. The language leaned on protocol, public safety, and responding to reports. It was meant to sound neutral, but the video made neutral hard to sell. Because viewers had watched deputies hold an innocent man in place while admitting the stop was being pushed by a sergeant. That detail mattered. It suggested that the escalation wasn't just random decision-making in the moment. It was a supervisor-driven choice to lean into detention even when the match was weak. Tomas didn't treat the viral attention like entertainment. He treated it like leverage. He made it clear through what he posted and how he talked about it that the issue wasn't hurt feelings. It was how quickly a vague description can become a justification for a high-pressure stop, and how easily that pressure can turn into something worse if the person detained makes one wrong movement or says one wrong sentence. He also kept everything organized: timestamps, clips, the sequence of events. Who said what and when? When the deputies acknowledged the description was unclear. When they admitted the push was coming from a sergeant. When they received the clear image and immediately backed off. That's how accountability works when you're serious. You don't rely on outrage, you rely on proof. Meanwhile, the actual suspect didn't disappear into the air. The suspected burglary wasn't some mystery with no outcome. The person who was actually involved, described later as a man who stole a leaf blower in Deltona, was eventually identified, located, and arrested. And the contrast made the situation even sharper. Tomas got a multi-card detention for jogging, while the real suspect was found the normal way, through clearer identification and follow-up. That outcome didn't erase what happened to Tomas. It confirmed it, because it proved the stop had never been solid. It had been a guess fueled by urgency and a description that wasn't good enough to justify how aggressively they treated him. As the clip kept circulating, more people in the area started sharing similar stories. People described being stopped because they fit something that was never specific. People described being treated like a suspect first and a citizen second. Even people who supported policing said the same thing. If descriptions are that vague, the system needs guardrails because otherwise it becomes a dragnet. That public pressure is what forced the behind-the-scenes part. Complaints got filed. Records requests got made. Supervisors had to answer internal questions about why multiple units were used, why the detention lasted as long as it did, and why the explanation kept shifting until the clearer image arrived. And that's the part a lot of viewers don't realize. Departments can ignore one angry phone call, but they can't easily ignore organized documentation plus viral evidence plus a clean timeline. What happened next wasn't a movie ending where everyone gets fired on the spot. It was more realistic. There were reviews, there were meetings, there were supervisors asking what the deputies believed the description was. At the moment they decided Tomas couldn't leave. There were questions about how a burglary response became a public detention of a cooperative runner. If the department had any sense, they also used it as a training example because that's what it was. A real-life demonstration of how fit the description can become a shortcut to bias, even when nobody wants to say the word out loud. And Tomas walked away with something that mattered. Not just the fact that he was cleared, but the fact that he was believed, because the footage made it impossible to rewrite him into a threat. He didn't have to prove his innocence through emotions. He proved it through reality. Over time, the neighborhood took its own lesson too. People got more careful about what they reported. Some people started asking better questions before calling things in, and others started watching police encounters differently. Less like entertainment, more like a moment where someone's life can change because of a bad assumption. And Tomas kept running, not because he forgot what happened, but because he refused to let that stop claim his routine, his peace, or his right to exist in public without being treated like a suspect. Here's the lesson that sat underneath the whole thing. When the system runs on vague descriptions and adrenaline, the first person who fits becomes the target. And if there's no camera, no witness, no oversight, the story can end up written by the people with the badge instead of the people telling the truth. So let me ask you, if you were Tomas, what would you have done differently, if anything? And if you've ever been stopped for fitting a description, drop it in the comments, because people need to hear how common this really is. If you want more true-to-life story times about everyday racism, power, and real accountability, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Hey, let me see your ID. What are you doing right here?
What's the reason you need my ID?
Don't play games. ID, now.
What is the reason?
You're loitering. This is a drug area.
What?
Hands right.
A local patrol officer decided a black man standing on a downtown block at lunchtime had to be a drug dealer. He walked up, demanded identification without stating a clear legal reason, and treated the man's calm, minimal answers as suspicious. Within minutes, the officer escalated it into a detention in front of a crowd, with cameras recording from multiple angles. Before we get into how it started and why it mattered, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel going. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch stories about accountability, body cameras, and people staying calm under pressure, like the video and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was midday on a busy downtown block. Office workers were out for lunch. Cars were double parked for deliveries. People were moving in and out of storefronts. In that same area, a federal team was running a street-level surveillance operation tied to a larger investigation. Special Agent Malcolm Reed was assigned to watch a specific section of the block and report movements. He was dressed to blend in. No visible badge, no police-style gear. He looked like a regular person standing outside during lunch. Reed was not there to talk to anyone. He was there to observe. His job depended on not drawing attention, and he could not give details about why he was in that spot. Officer Ryan Kessler was on patrol in the area. He was not part of the federal operation. He drove past the block, noticed Reed standing still near a storefront, and made an assumption based on appearance and presence alone. Kessler parked and walked directly toward Reed. He immediately demanded identification and asked what Reed was doing there. He did not describe a specific call, a specific complaint, or any clear facts connecting Reed to a crime. He treated it like Reed owed him an explanation. Reed kept his responses short. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain his assignment. He asked if he was being detained and what the reason was for the demand. Kessler took that as resistance. He repeated the demand for ID and began building vague reasons out loud. He suggested Reed matched the description. He claimed Reed was loitering. He implied drug activity without pointing to any actual behavior. People nearby started paying attention. Some slowed down. A few took out phones. One bystander, Tanya Morales, began recording steadily from several steps away. Kessler's body camera was running as well. That footage later became central. Kessler stepped closer and told Reed to place his hands where he could see them. Reed complied. Kessler then moved Reed toward the wall and began a frisk. Reed did not pull away or argue physically. He stayed controlled and still. Kessler was not satisfied. He treated Reed's calm behavior as suspicious and called for backup. A second officer arrived. Kessler spoke as if he already had justification, but he still did not name a specific crime supported by specific facts. He described Reed as evasive because Reed would not give detailed answers. Kessler then escalated the encounter to a detention. He told Reed he was being detained, moved Reed's hands behind his back, and put him in handcuffs on the sidewalk in front of passing pedestrians. Reed stayed calm. He did not resist. He did not reveal his identity. At that point, protecting the federal operations still mattered, and he did not want to expose the surveillance assignment on an open sidewalk. Kessler treated the cuffs like confirmation that his assumption was correct. He began moving Reed toward his patrol car to continue the detention and start the paperwork process that would justify it. But the detention itself had already created attention. Phones were up, the body camera was running, and the scene was now public. Once Reed was secured and it was clear the stop had already disrupted the mission, Reed made a decision. He would stop protecting the operation and identify himself. Reed waited until the cuffs were on and the detention was complete. He did not reveal anything while the officers still had the chance to turn the sidewalk into a scene that could compromise the federal team's target. But once Kessler started walking him towards the patrol car, it was clear the operation was already disrupted. People were watching. Phones were recording. The stop was now public. Reed stopped his feet and told Kessler, in a calm and even tone, that he was a federal agent. He gave his name and identified the agency. He also told Kessler exactly what mattered most in that moment. The officer had detained him without clear legal cause, interfered with an active federal mission, and created a case that would follow him personally. Kessler reacted the way officers often do when they realize they misjudged the person they targeted. He didn't immediately apologize. He tried to regain control. He demanded proof. Reed didn't argue. He told Kessler where his credentials were and explained that pulling them out while cuffed wasn't possible without the officer's help. He also told him that there were other federal personnel nearby who could confirm, and that the easiest way to handle it was to call a supervisor and slow everything down. Kessler didn't slow down. He tried to press forward like it was still a normal street stop. He asked Reed more questions, trying to get Reed to explain himself. Reed stayed minimal and focused. He told him the explanation would be documented through the proper chain and that the current detention was already a rights issue. This is where the tone changed around them. The backup officer, who had been following Kessler's lead, hesitated. He didn't take over, but he didn't look comfortable either. He glanced between Kessler and Reed, and then at the phones pointed at them. He understood the risk of staying attached to someone else's bad decision. Kessler then did what a lot of officers do when they feel control slipping. He started justifying the stop out loud for the camera. He described Reed's behavior as suspicious. He referenced vague complaints and general drug activity in the area. He leaned on words that sound reasonable in a report, but mean nothing without facts. Reed didn't let him rewrite reality in real time. He told Kessler the justification didn't match what actually happened, and that the video would show the sequence clearly. The officer approached first, demanded ID first, escalated first, and detained without articulating a specific crime supported by observable facts. Then Reed delivered the part that landed hardest. He told Kessler this would not be handled as an oops. He told him the department would face a lawsuit. He told him the officer's own report would be compared line by line against the body camera and the bystander footage. And he told him that when that happened, the officer would not be protected. Kessler finally got on his radio and called for a supervisor, but even that was done like he was trying to manage optics, not fix the rights violation. He used a tone that implied he had a guy claiming to be federal, rather than admitting he might have detained the wrong person without cause. Within minutes, a sergeant arrived. Sergeant Holloway approached quickly, already trying to keep the situation quiet. He asked what was going on, and Kessler gave him the short version that made the stop sound cleaner than it was. Reed corrected it without raising his voice. He told the sergeant he was FBI, assigned to a surveillance mission on that block, and had been detained based on appearance and presence rather than any specific crime. He also told him the stop had now compromised federal work and triggered a legal and administrative problem the department could not control. Holloway asked for credentials. Reed told him exactly where they were. Holloway looked at Kessler and told him to remove the cuffs and retrieve them. Kessler hesitated. Holloway repeated the order. Kessler unlocked the cuffs. Reed immediately handed over his credentials. Holloway checked them carefully because now the sergeant understood this wasn't a normal stop and it wasn't going to be handled with casual explanations. Holloway stepped away and made calls. You could see it in his posture. The moment the credentials checked out, this stopped being a street interaction and became an incident. Kessler tried to talk over it, still defending the stop. He started listing reasons again. Reed didn't argue with every point. He focused on what would matter later: the lack of cause, the escalation, and the fact that the officer's story was already being recorded from multiple angles. Tanya Morales kept recording. She didn't get involved. She didn't approach. She just held the phone steady. Her video captured the cuffs, the tone, the moment Reed identified himself, and the shift in the officer's behavior after the credentials came out. Holloway returned and told Kessler to step back. He told Reed he was no longer detained and asked if he needed medical attention. Reed said no. He didn't act dramatic. He didn't posture. He simply stated he needed to contact his supervisor immediately because the operation had been disrupted. Holloway offered to move the conversation off the sidewalk. Reed declined. He knew why departments prefer private spaces after public mistakes. Reed wanted the timeline clear and the public scene documented, because the public scene was the truth. Reed called his supervisory special agent. He reported what happened in a structured way: time, location, officer name, the detention sequence, and the fact that civilian recording existed. He also reported the operational disruption and the safety risks created by drawing attention to the surveillance area. Within a short time, unmarked federal vehicles staged nearby, not for a show, but to stabilize what Kessler had destabilized. A federal supervisor arrived, spoke briefly with Reed, then approached Holloway with controlled urgency. The conversation between supervisors was short and serious. Holloway's tone changed again. This was now going up chains he couldn't influence. Kessler stood off to the side, watching his earlier confidence drain out. He had made a decision in public based on a biased assumption. He had escalated it in public, and now he had a federal agent, a sergeant, body camera footage, and civilian video, all pointing at the same problem. Before Reed left the scene to rejoin the federal team and assess the operational damage, he looked directly at Kessler and made the final point simple. The video and the paperwork were going to be compared, and that comparison would decide what happened next. By the end of that day, Kessler had already started protecting himself the way officers often do after a bad stop. He wrote his report like the camera didn't exist. He described the encounter as a proactive stop based on reasonable suspicion. He claimed Reed matched a vague description connected to drug activity. He wrote that Reed was evasive, uncooperative, and caused him to fear for safety. He also framed the cuffing as a necessary step to secure the scene while he investigated. The problem was that the body camera showed the sequence clearly, and the sequence is what makes or breaks these cases. The video showed Kessler initiating contact without a specific call or complaint. It showed him demanding identification before articulating any clear facts tied to a crime. It showed Reed staying controlled and minimal, not hostile, not threatening, not trying to flee. It showed the escalation coming from Kessler, not from Reed. Then the bystander video filled in what body cameras sometimes miss: the wider scene. It captured how quickly the public noticed. It captured the cuffing in full view of pedestrians. It captured the moment Reed identified himself and how the officer's posture changed after credentials were confirmed. Within 48 hours, the footage was no longer a rumor. It was in the hands of multiple people who had authority to act on it. Reed's supervisory chain reported the interference as a formal incident because it disrupted a federal mission and created a safety and integrity issue. At the same time, Reed's attorney preserved evidence and sent notices that made it clear the department was on the clock for records retention, including Bodycam, dispatch logs, CAD entries, and any related reports. That combination mattered. Federal involvement meant the department couldn't stall. Legal preservation meant the department couldn't lose things without it becoming another violation. Internal Affairs opened a case, not a casual review. a formal one with full video, report comparison, and data pulls. And once IA started digging, Kessler's stop wasn't an isolated problem anymore. It was a door into his entire pattern. They pulled his stop history. They pulled the demographic breakdown. They pulled his use of matched description language and how often it appeared in reports without an actual description attached. They pulled body camera compliance records. They pulled complaints that had been closed as not sustained because there wasn't enough evidence. Now there was evidence. A DOJ civil rights reviewer also requested information because the incident involved a federal agent detained without clear cause during a federal operation. That added another layer. It wasn't just policy. It was constitutional, and it was now being examined by people outside the department. The pattern showed up fast. Kessler had a high volume of stops compared to peers assigned to similar areas. His stops disproportionately involved Black residents and Black visitors to the downtown area. His reports repeatedly used the same justification phrases: suspicious behavior, evasive answers, failure to provide ID, officer safety concerns. The wording looked consistent, too consistent. Investigators started comparing his reports to body cam clips from prior stops, not just one or two, enough to show whether his language matched what actually happened. They found repeated gaps. The body cam would show normal, calm responses, but his report would describe people as agitated or hostile. The body cam would show him escalating quickly, but his report would imply the person forced escalation. The body cam would show him asking for ID before stating a reason, but his report would claim he developed suspicion first. In multiple cases, his reports treated a person's questions about legality as refusal to cooperate. That's a key difference. Asking questions is not a crime, but in his writing, it became a reason to detain. IA also looked at whether supervisors had been warned. They found that Kessler wasn't new to complaints. He had a trail. There were prior complaints about aggressive stops, unnecessary searches, and people being detained for vague reasons. Those complaints hadn't resulted in discipline. Supervisors had treated them as public misunderstanding, officer discretion, no video, or he's proactive. Now that explanation didn't hold. When the Reed footage hit internal review, supervisors couldn't claim it was unclear. They couldn't claim the citizen was lying. They couldn't claim the officer was being targeted unfairly. The camera showed the encounter from start to cuffs, and it showed how Kessler tried to justify it afterward. The department's legal unit became involved immediately because by the time the footage circulated, the risk was obvious. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a rights violation with a clean timeline and multiple recordings. It had a federal dimension, and it had a pattern sitting behind it. At that point, the department tried to do what departments often do to stop the bleeding. They attempted to frame it as a single mistake by one officer, but the data made that harder. The review didn't just show Kessler's choices. It showed how often his supervisors accepted his reports without scrutiny, even when stop outcomes were thin and the justifications were repetitive. It showed a lack of meaningful correction. Reed's case became the one they couldn't ignore because the person detained had institutional power, and the incident interfered with the federal mission. But the review made it clear that the same tactics had been used on people who didn't have a badge and couldn't force oversight. During the following weeks, Kessler was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His body camera footage from the incident was flagged as critical evidence. His report was formally challenged. He was interviewed by IA. He was asked to explain why the stop was initiated, what specific facts created suspicion, and why the detention escalated to cuffs. Those interviews are where officers usually rely on training and experience language. But in this case, training and experience couldn't explain the missing facts. And the more Kessler tried to defend his decision, the more he locked himself into a story the video contradicted. Meanwhile, Reed stayed disciplined. He didn't go on social media. He didn't do interviews. He handled it through official channels, but his attorney made sure the case didn't get buried and that the department understood the exposure. By week 3, the department was no longer asking if Kessler made a mistake. They were working through how much damage his pattern had already done and how much liability it created. Because when a department learns an officer exaggerates to justify detentions, every case that officer touched becomes questionable. By the time the reviews reached their final stage, the department's leadership understood 2 things. First, the detention of Malcolm Reed wasn't defensible on the facts shown on video. Second, Kessler's stop history made it impossible to treat this as a one-time judgment error. Internal Affairs completed its findings with a direct comparison. Kessler's written report next to the body camera and the bystander video. The contradictions weren't small. They were foundational. The report claimed a clear reason for suspicion that the footage didn't show. The report framed Reed as evasive and threatening in ways the footage didn't support. The report suggested a developing investigation when the video showed Kessler demanding ID first and building reasons afterward. That's the kind of mismatch that destroys an officer's credibility. Once credibility collapses, the job becomes hard to protect. Departments can defend mistakes. They can't defend patterns of exaggeration tied to rights violations captured clearly on camera. The DOJ reviewer's involvement made the stakes higher. This wasn't only about policy violations. It was about constitutional violations tied to biased enforcement. And now there was documentation showing the department had warning signs long before this incident. The department moved toward termination, and it didn't happen quietly inside a back office the way they prefer. The footage had already spread. People downtown recognized the location. The bystander video was shared widely. Community groups asked why the officer was still employed. Local reporters requested records. At the same time, the department's legal counsel began settlement talks because the liability picture was clear. The damages weren't only about the cuffing. The damages included the unlawful detention, the public humiliation, the operational interference, and the fact that the stop was driven by assumptions rather than articulable facts. The department also faced the wider issue. The review tied this incident to a larger pattern, which made the risk of trial worse. A trial would have opened the department's internal history, the stop data, the complaints, the supervisor notes, the decisions to ignore. Everything. That's why the settlement number climbed. In the end, the case closed with a $4 million settlement. It was large enough to make the department's budget people angry, and public enough to make leadership stop pretending this was minor. Then came the personnel decision. Kessler was terminated. The department's termination letter cited policy violations tied to improper stops, escalation without sufficient legal cause, and report accuracy issues. The final decision relied heavily on the fact that his written account did not match the footage, and that the same issues appeared across multiple prior stops when those videos were reviewed. And Kessler wasn't the only one affected. The review didn't stop at the person holding the cuffs. It also examined who signed off on his behavior for years. Supervisors who repeatedly dismissed complaints and accepted thin justifications faced discipline. Some were removed from supervisory roles. At minimum, the department had to acknowledge internally and publicly that the pattern existed and that it was ignored until it hit someone the system couldn't casually minimize. The department also made operational changes, not because it suddenly wanted to, but because the settlement and the federal review forced it. They tightened requirements for articulating reasonable suspicion in reports. They changed documentation rules, so matched description could not be used without a documented description reference. They increased audits of stop data by race and location. They strengthened body camera compliance and made it harder to end recordings early without consequences. They also created an early warning threshold that triggered review when an officer's stop volume and complaint history crossed certain limits. Those changes didn't fix everything overnight, but they changed the department's ability to pretend it wasn't happening. For Reed, the outcome was clear but not celebratory. He didn't treat it like a victory lap. He treated it like accountability that should have happened earlier before other people were pulled into the same situation without the ability to force review. He also treated it like a reminder of how quickly professionalism gets read the wrong way when someone has already decided what they think they're seeing. He had stayed calm. He had stayed controlled. He had given minimal answers to protect a mission. And none of that stopped an officer from escalating, because the officer wasn't reacting to behavior. He was reacting to assumption. The key lesson in this case wasn't complicated. The video showed what happened. The report tried to describe something else. And when those two were placed side by side, the truth won. That's what ended Kessler's career. Not a speech, not a rumor, not a viral headline. A clean timeline and a clear record. So here's the question for you. If you were standing on that sidewalk watching it happen, what would you have done? Would you have recorded? Would you have kept walking? Have you ever seen a situation where the official story didn't match what people witnessed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been through something similar, share what happened. And if you want more real-world story times about accountability, recorded proof, and consequences that actually stick, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.
Stand up. Need your ID. What is wrong? Just give me your identification.
What's the legal reason you need it?
You're too suspicious. I'm not going back and forth. Stand up, now.
I'm requesting a supervisor, right now.
A local officer thought he could walk into a quiet downtown cafe, single out a black man minding his own business, and demand identification like it was a personal right. What he didn't know was that the calm man at the window table wasn't just another customer he could pressure into complying. He was the head of internal affairs, and every step the officer took was about to become evidence. And before we jump in, we just want to say, we're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support is what keeps this channel going. Now tell us where you're watching from in the comments, your country, your city, your state. And if you like stories where arrogance meets cameras, policy, and real consequences, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with careers, charges, and a sentence nobody expected. So here's what happened. It was a weekday morning downtown. The cafe was the kind of place packed with laptops and quiet conversations 2 blocks from the courthouse, with security cameras in plain sight. People were in work clothes, students were studying, and the staff were moving fast behind the counter. Malcolm Pierce sat alone near the front window. He was black, late 40s, dressed like any other professional on a day off. Coffee on the table, laptop open, phone set to the side. Nothing loud, nothing confrontational. Just a man using a public space the way everyone else was. Malcolm also happened to be the head of internal affairs for the city's police department, but nobody in that cafe knew that, and Malcolm made sure it stayed that way. Officer Tyler Grady walked in without ordering anything. He didn't scan the pastry case or check the line. He scanned people. He moved with the attitude of someone used to turning normal situations into contacts that looked productive on paper. He locked onto Malcolm and went straight to the table. Grady demanded identification immediately without giving a clear reason. He positioned himself close enough that Malcolm couldn't stand up and leave without bumping into him. That body positioning mattered because it quietly turned a casual demand into a controlled space. Malcolm didn't argue and he didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach into his pockets. He kept his hands visible on the table and asked one clean question that forces accountability, whether he was being detained or free to leave. Grady avoided answering. Instead, he repeated the ID demand and treated Malcolm's question like disrespect. Then Grady tried to justify it after the fact. He claimed Malcolm looked suspicious. He implied Malcolm matched a description. He suggested the cafe had concerns. The problem was the room itself didn't match the story. The staff looked confused, not relieved. The customers looked uncomfortable, not protected. And the cafe manager, Asha Moreno, stepped out from behind the counter and watched closely because she could tell this wasn't a response to a call. It was an officer creating a reason in real time. Malcolm stayed in the same calm posture. He asked what specific facts supported the demand. He asked what legal cause existed. Grady escalated by shifting to control language. He treated Malcolm's refusal to hand over ID as non-compliance, even though there was no clear lawful basis stated for the demand. He warned Malcolm that refusing would lead to consequences. That was the first major procedural mistake, trying to convert a voluntary request into a forced demand without articulable cause. Grady then moved the encounter toward detention without doing the one thing that makes detention lawful, stating specific, checkable facts tied to a crime. He kept it vague on purpose because vague sounds safe in the moment. Vague also collapses later when video exists, and video did exist. Grady's body camera was on. The cafe's security cameras covered the seating area from multiple angles. Asha knew exactly where those cameras pointed and how long footage stayed stored. She quietly noted the time and which cameras had a clean view of the table. A barista named Eli Tran also noticed the pattern. He saw an officer crowding a seated customer, heard the tone, and watched the officer refuse to explain the stop. Eli didn't want to get involved directly, but he did what a lot of people do now when they feel something is off. He pulled out his phone and started recording audio discreetly while keeping his distance. Grady tried another pressure tactic. He told Malcolm to stand up. Malcolm didn't stand. He stayed controlled and asked for a supervisor. Grady brushed past that and acted like his own authority was enough. Then Asha stepped closer and made it clear, in a manager's tone, that Malcolm was a paying customer and that staff had not requested police intervention. She didn't challenge the officer emotionally. She challenged the basis of the officer being there. Grady responded by dismissing her input and continuing the stop anyway. That was the moment the encounter shifted from questionable to openly reckless, because Grady was now overriding the very business concern he had implied earlier. The excuse stopped matching the reality in the room, and the cameras captured that mismatch clearly. Malcolm still didn't reveal who he was. He could have ended it instantly by identifying himself. But Malcolm understood something most people never get to use. The best accountability case is the one where the officer can't claim he was treated differently because of rank. So Malcolm let the officer keep choosing his own steps. Grady then called for backup and described the situation in a way that made Malcolm sound like a problem. He used language that would prime the next officer to arrive ready to handle someone, not to evaluate legality. That was another procedural violation starting to form, creating a misleading narrative over the radio to justify actions already taken. Within minutes, a second unit arrived. The responding officer walked in, looked at the scene, an officer standing over a calm, seated man, a manager nearby, a room full of witnesses, cameras on the ceiling, and hesitated just long enough to show he wasn't fully buying what he'd been told. Grady didn't like that hesitation. He immediately pushed for physical control, instructing the responding officer to help him force the situation forward. Malcolm didn't go back to the cafe. He didn't call the precinct from the street. He handled it the way he expected any resident to handle it, because he wanted the process to be clean. That afternoon, he wrote a timeline while it was still fresh. He listed the time window, the exact location, what Grady did first, what Grady claimed as justification, how the justification changed, when Grady called for backup, when the physical contact started, and when the supervisor ended it. He kept it factual and short. Then he filed a formal complaint through the public intake channel. He also sent a preservation request. He requested the full body camera files for Grady and the assisting officer, the dispatch audio, CAD logs, GPS pings, supervisor communications, and any in-car video tied to the units that arrived. He specified the full-time window, not just the few minutes outside. That mattered because a lot of cases got shaped by missing context. Malcolm wasn't giving anyone room to trim the story. At the cafe, Asha did what she said she would do. She pulled the footage from every camera with a view of Malcolm's table, the aisle, the entrance, and the sidewalk. She saved a longer segment than most people would, starting before Grady entered and ending after the supervisor left. She also wrote her own statement while it was fresh and got contact info from 2 customers who said they'd confirm what they saw. Eli saved his audio recording and gave it to Asha so it could be stored with the cafe footage instead of sitting on a personal phone. 2 days later, Grady submitted his report. It was the kind of report that tried to make the stop sound routine and lawful. It leaned on vague suspicion. It referenced a description without details. It described Malcolm as non-compliant. It emphasized resisting to justify going hands-on. It also included the trespass angle, even though the manager had rejected that in real time. The complaint would normally have been routed for a standard review first. Malcolm made sure that didn't happen. Not by taking control of the case, but by doing the opposite. He disclosed internally that he was the complainant, and he formally recused himself in writing. He assigned the investigation to his deputy, Raymond Holt, with clear instructions. Run it like any other citizen complaint, document everything, and do not treat it as a special case in either direction. Holt opened the file and immediately treated it like a case that could turn into a lawsuit or a federal issue. First, he issued evidence holds. He locked down the Bodycam file's dispatch data and any related digital logs, so nothing could be overwritten. Second, he collected the cafe footage directly from Asha and documented chain of custody. He didn't accept a text message clip. He took the original exports from the system with timestamps. Third, he pulled the body camera files and compared them against the cafe angles. That comparison created the first clear problem. The cafe footage showed the approach, the lack of a clear stated reason, the manager contradicting any business complaint, and Malcolm staying controlled. It also showed the moment Grady went hands-on, and it showed how quickly Grady labeled it resisting. Grady's body camera captured the sound and general sequence, but the angle got worse during the most important outside portion. Holt noted it, then requested the file metadata and the audit logs. He wanted to know if the file had been edited, re-uploaded, trimmed, or processed in any way outside normal procedure. At the same time, Holt reviewed Grady's recent activity because the language in the report looked familiar. It used the same phrases that showed up in other complaints: suspicious behavior, matched description, refusing lawful orders, consent, resisting. Holt pulled Grady's stop history for the last year and filtered it by location and unit. The number of contacts was high compared to other officers working the same downtown area. The number of stops that resulted in actual charges was low. The number of searches marked as consent was unusually high. That didn't prove anything by itself, but it told Holt where to look next. He pulled a sample of past incidents tied to Grady and the same small cluster of officers in that downtown unit. He matched them to any available video, any citizen recordings, and any prior complaints that had been closed. Then he started seeing the same pattern over and over. Stops justified with vague descriptions. Reports that sounded polished, but didn't include specific facts. Body cam issues that seemed to happen during the critical moments. People being labeled as resisting when the video didn't show aggression. One case had a report claiming a man agreed to a search, but the audio didn't show a clear agreement. Another case had a report claiming a woman made a threatening movement, but the video showed her hands up. Another case had a camera malfunction that began right before an alleged discovery. Holt documented each discrepancy. He didn't jump to conclusions. He built a list. Then he received the audit logs related to Grady's body cam file from the cafe incident. The logs showed access and handling that didn't match standard workflow. The file had been opened and processed more than once before it was officially turned over for review. Holt flagged it immediately. That was the first moment the case shifted from a bad stop to a potential evidence issue. Holt briefed command staff with a summary that stayed clean and professional. Clear contradictions between report and video, concerns about body cam handling, and indicators that this might not be an isolated event. Command staff tried to contain it at first. They discussed quick discipline, retraining, and moving Grady out of downtown. Holt shut that down by pointing to the evidence handling concerns. If evidence was being manipulated, internal fixes weren't enough. Holt scheduled formal interviews. Asha, Eli, the two customers, the assisting officer, the supervisor, and Grady. Grady's interview followed the same line as his report. He insisted the stop was lawful. He repeated the vague justification. He emphasized resisting. When Holt pressed for specifics, Grady couldn't provide clear details that matched the footage. Holt also asked about the camera angle shift outside. Grady said it was incidental. Holt didn't argue. He logged the answer, then logged the audit data that suggested the file had been handled in a way that required explanation. By the end of the second week, Holt had enough to take the next step without guessing. He prepared a referral package focused on two things: pattern indicators tied to the downtown unit and possible evidence handling violations connected to Grady's camera files. That package didn't accuse. It presented facts, comparisons, and timestamps. Holt didn't send a vague summary up the chain. He sent a tight packet. It had the cafe security timestamps, the Bodycam timestamps, the dispatch log, and the exact places where Grady's report didn't match what the cameras showed. It also included the Bodycam handling logs that showed the file was accessed and processed more than it should have been before it was turned over for review. Once that packet landed, the department couldn't treat this like a normal complaint. Command staff pulled in legal counsel and ordered a review of the downtown proactive unit, not just Grady. They requested stop data, search rates, complaint history, and body cam availability for the entire unit over a defined period. They tried the usual first move: quiet containment. Grady was pulled off the street and placed on administrative duty pending investigation. The department also ordered him not to discuss the case and not to access any related files. Holt kept building the case on proof, not opinions. He interviewed Asha and secured the original security exports with chain of custody documentation. He took Eli's audio file and logged it the same way. He interviewed the assisting officer and documented that Grady's radio framing didn't match what the assisting officer saw upon arrival. He interviewed Sergeant Klein and documented that Klein ended the stop because the justification wasn't holding and the situation was becoming a public problem. Then Holt went wider. He pulled a sample of prior stops from Grady and the same unit. He compared reports to any available video and dispatch logs. The pattern showed up fast. Vague justifications repeated across stops, high consent search claims, low actual charges, and video gaps or malfunctions during key moments. He also found repeated report language that looked copied and reused, like officers were writing from a script instead of documenting real specific facts. In several cases, the scripted language didn't match video. That's when the risk changed. This wasn't just a bad stop. It looked like a unit practice. Holt escalated again, this time with a second referral, focused on constitutional violations and evidence handling issues. He didn't label it as criminal in the memo. He laid out facts and logs that made outside review unavoidable. When outside investigators requested records, the tone inside the department shifted immediately. Supervisors got cautious. Officers stopped talking freely. Command staff started holding meetings with lawyers present. Grady reacted badly. He complained that he was being targeted, tried to figure out who filed the cafe complaint, and kept assuming it was some guy trying to make trouble. He still didn't know it was Malcolm, and Malcolm still stayed fully recused. So nobody could claim this was personal. By the end of the month, multiple members of the downtown unit were under review. Some were reassigned, some were suspended. Supervisors were being questioned about how reports were approved without verifying video. The first real break didn't come from a confession. It came from records. Federal investigators lined up 3 things across stops tied to Grady's downtown unit: dispatch data, body cam availability, and the wording in reports. They were looking for repeat contradictions, not one-off mistakes. They found them fast. They found reports claiming calls for service when dispatch showed no call. They found matched description language with no description that could be verified. They found repeated consent search claims where audio didn't show clear consent and where people were asking if they had a choice and not getting a straight answer. Then they focused on files. The cafe incident was the cleanest example because there were 2 independent recordings: the officer's body cam and the cafe's security system. When investigators compared them, the timeline held, but the most important moment had a problem. The body cam angle got worse right when Grady went hands-on. The cafe footage stayed clear the entire time. Investigators pulled evidence handling policy and compared it to what the log showed for the body cam file. The file had a handling trail that didn't match normal workflow. It showed access and processing outside the standard review path before the footage was officially requested through the complaint. That pushed the case from policy violations into evidence issues. They went back to older stops tied to the same unit and found similar patterns. Not every stop had missing footage, but enough did, and the gaps clustered around the exact moments that mattered: searches, handcuffs, and resisting claims. The reports also used the same wording over and over, like they were written from a shared script. Federal agents interviewed civilians who had filed older complaints and never heard back. Some still had phone videos, some had screenshots, some had paperwork from detentions that never led to charges. The stories were consistent: vague reasons, pressure tactics, and then reports that made it sound lawful afterward. Then they interviewed officers. A junior officer gave a practical statement. The unit had a habit of keeping report language consistent, and certain officers would help clean up reports so supervisors wouldn't question them. Investigators didn't build the case on that statement alone. They used it to target proof. They subpoenaed internal communications, draft histories were available, access logs, and supervisor approval patterns. They looked for who touched reports before submission and who approved without checking video. That's where they found the messages that mattered: discussion about keeping reports tight, making sure wording matched, and concern about the cafe incident becoming a thing. It wasn't a movie-style confession. It was enough to show intent to manage the record. Then Grady did the worst possible thing while under review. He was on administrative duty and under orders not to access related files. He attempted access anyway. The system logged it with his credentials and a timestamp. It wasn't someone's opinion, it was a record. That became the clean evidence tampering lane, violating access restrictions during an active investigation tied to footage already backed up by a private business system. Once that was in place, the department moved to protect itself. Grady was terminated. The downtown unit as it existed was shut down and restructured. Supervisors who approved the reports without verification were removed from that chain pending review. The city publicly confirmed cooperation with federal investigators because it was past the point where they could pretend it was contained. Now, the federal case took center stage. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges focused on civil rights violations and evidence tampering. The civil rights side targeted unlawful detentions and stops built on race-based suspicion and vague justifications. The evidence side targeted the attempts to interfere with body cam handling and the pattern of report falsification tied to video gaps. When the case went public, Malcolm's name finally entered the story, not because he announced himself in the cafe, but because paperwork and sworn filings made it unavoidable. The irony was obvious. The person Grady tried to bully into handing over ID was the person responsible for investigating officers who violated policy and law. The defense tried the standard approach. They argued Grady acted in good faith. They claimed the footage didn't show everything. They tried to frame the body cam angle shift as accidental. They pointed to officer discretion and said the stops were based on training and experience. The prosecution kept it simple. They played the cafe footage next to the body cam footage and let the jury watch the story change in real time. They showed the manager contradicting the business concern angle. They showed the lack of a stated crime. They showed the escalation when Malcolm asked basic legal questions. They showed how resisting was claimed without matching behavior. Then they showed the logs, file access that didn't follow policy, access attempts during investigation, and messages that showed people were thinking about controlling the narrative. They also brought in the pattern evidence. Multiple stops with the same vague language, the same consent claims, the same report style, and the same convenient video problems. That's what made it bigger than one incident. The jury wasn't asked to decide whether Grady had a bad day. They were shown a method. Grady was convicted. At sentencing, the judge didn't treat it like a paperwork issue. The judge treated it like what it was: abuse of authority backed by falsified documentation, aimed at people who were targeted because they were easy to target until the day the wrong person sat at the wrong table with cameras everywhere. Grady received 15 years in federal prison, not probation, not a short sentence. 15 years. After the sentencing, the fallout continued. The city settled several civil lawsuits tied to the unit's stops. The department implemented stricter stop documentation rules and mandatory body cam audits with random reviews. Supervisors were required to verify video before approving reports in certain categories of stops. The downtown unit's mandate changed, and the oversight structure changed with it. Internally, the case became a training example, not the sanitized kind, the kind that shows exactly how a stop becomes unlawful step by step, and how I can do what I want turns into I can't explain what I did. Malcolm never needed to embarrass anyone in public to prove a point. He handled it through process, evidence, and a clean chain of documentation. He let the system record its own failure, then forced it to face the record. And if you're watching this thinking about how often people are told to just comply and deal with it later, here's the reality. Later only works when there's proof. And proof only exists when someone preserves it and the process isn't allowed to bury it. What would you have done in that cafe? Would you have argued? Would you have recorded? Would you have walked out and hoped it ended? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've seen something like this in your own city, share what happened. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick with us for more stories where accountability actually lands.
Step back. Hands where I can see them now.
We're recording. What's your name and badge number? You can't
Stop arguing and comply.
Don't touch me. I'm not a threat. Why are you coming at me?
Back up now.
I'm on my porch, man.
You can't. Back up. Control 321, start me another unit.
It started as a neighbor argument, and then suddenly there were officers at the door, acting like they were hunting a threat. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. State, city, or country. And if you're here for real stories about rights, body cam footage, and accountability, when police escalate a situation that never needed to escalate, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. This took place in Park City, Utah. A 15-year-old boy named Jack had been riding a gas-powered bicycle around his neighborhood. Loud engine, neighborhood complaints, the kind of thing that usually ends with someone telling a kid to slow down or take it somewhere else. But it didn't stay normal. A neighbor confronted Jack, and the confrontation turned into a threat. Jack went home and told his father, Michael Franek. Michael's response wasn't to run outside swinging. He moved like a parent, trying to handle a dispute before it spiraled. Figure out what happened, address it, and keep his kids safe. Somewhere in that chain of events, a call went to police. And during that call, someone reported something that changed the entire posture of the response. They claimed Michael had a weapon in his waistband. That's the tiny detail that flipped this from a neighbor dispute into a high-risk arrival. Officers showed up treating the situation like a potential armed encounter. The distance they kept at first, the way they positioned themselves, the way the tone immediately leaned toward commands instead of questions. They weren't arriving to mediate. They were arriving to control. Michael stepped out to meet them. Right away, he tried to establish something basic. Who they were. Names, badge numbers, badge. The kind of information that creates accountability and prevents later confusion about who did what. But the officers treated that like a challenge. Instead of answering and keeping it calm, they moved the interaction into a compliance test. Their focus wasn't on verifying facts about the neighbor dispute. Their focus was on whether Michael would submit instantly and fully. That's the first power move in situations like this. Convert a conversation into a comply or else moment, even when the underlying call is still unclear. Inside the home, Jack saw the energy and started recording on his phone. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was a teenager watching adults with authority treat his father like a threat based on an unverified claim. Jack's instinct was simple: document everything. That documentation mattered because it limited the room officers had to reshape the story later. As the officers continued, Michael kept asking for identification and basic explanations. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He was trying to keep the situation grounded. If someone truly believed he was armed, the logical move would have been to confirm that claim carefully, with clear instructions and verification. But instead, the officers stayed stuck in aggressive posture, while the actual facts stayed thin. And that's where the risk grows fast. High-risk energy with low-quality information. Jack kept recording and also asserted boundaries as a witness in his own home. He complained that an officer got close enough to invade his space and physically touched him while ordering him to back up. Jack wasn't the one being accused of anything, but the scene had already shifted into everyone is a problem to manage. Michael tried to keep the contact at the doorway level. No one inside, no one pushing through, no one taking over the home. He stayed focused on procedure, who they were, what they were doing, and why they were escalating without presenting evidence of a real crime. And this is where the chess game gets obvious. If officers entered that call expecting an armed suspect, then backing down would make them look like they overreacted. So the incentive becomes to justify the response by turning normal questions into non-compliance and non-compliance into force. That's what was building. The officers kept pressing. Their language stayed centered on compliance. Michael kept pressing for names, badge numbers, and lawful bases. Jack kept recording and speaking up because he could see the gap between what this started as and how it was being treated. By this point, it wasn't just tense. It was unstable, because the next step wasn't going to be more talking. The next step was going to be physical movement toward the home. Officers pushing forward and treating the doorway like permission. And once that happens, the situation stops being a neighbor dispute entirely. It becomes a rights violation question, captured on camera, in a place where the law is supposed to be the clearest. Someone's home. Once the officers started pressing forward, the whole interaction stopped being a doorstep conversation and became a control problem in their minds. Michael stayed focused on keeping it procedural. He kept trying to slow it down and keep the boundary clear. They were at his home, responding to a neighbor dispute, and the weapon claim was still unverified. He wanted names, badge numbers, and a clear reason for what they were about to do. The officers treated his pace as refusal. That's the key switch that drives escalation. When officers decide a person is refusing, they stop listening for facts and start building momentum for force. Jack stayed on his phone and kept recording. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't trying to get in the officers' faces. He stayed close enough to document, but far enough to show he wasn't a threat. Even so, one officer closed space toward Jack and ordered him back. Jack protested that the officer was crowding him and making physical contact while directing him to move. Jack's point was simple. He was a teenager in his own home, recording, and an officer was treating him like part of the problem. Meanwhile, Michael was still outside the threshold, trying to keep the encounter from turning into a push inside the house. The officers didn't pause to verify the waistband claim in a careful way. They didn't do a controlled check and then reset the situation. Instead, they continued the same pattern: give rapid orders, treat questions as resistance, and move closer. Then the tipping point hit. Officers pushed into the home without a warrant. That detail wasn't a technicality. It changed the entire legal and physical reality of the incident. Once officers crossed that line, Michael's attempt to keep the situation calm turned into him trying to keep his home from being taken over. The officers closed on him fast. The moment his body position didn't match their exact instructions, they treated it as a reason to go hands-on. They grabbed him, they took him down. The movement was abrupt and chaotic, not a measured arrest based on a clear crime. It looked like a takedown designed to win control first and explain later. Jack's recording captured the shift. One moment it was argument and procedure, the next it was physical force. Michael ended up on the ground and was tased during the struggle. Officers framed it as necessary because he was not complying, but even as they forced control, their own body cam captured something that mattered. They acknowledged they didn't have solid evidence of an underlying crime driving this level of force. That contradiction is what made this incident explode later. Because if there was no confirmed weapon, no confirmed burglary, and no confirmed violent offense, then what exactly justified rushing into a home, tackling a homeowner, and using a taser? The officers kept pushing the compliance narrative. They treated every movement and every word as something to correct. It wasn't about resolving the neighbor dispute anymore. It was about proving they could dominate the scene. Jack stayed filming through it. He kept asserting that the officers didn't have a warrant and that the situation started as a neighbor dispute, not a violent crime. He didn't magically stop the officers, but he did something important. He kept the record clean. He showed who was escalating and when. And this is where the power chess got ugly. Because once officers use force in a situation that doesn't clearly justify it, the next move is often to protect the decision. That protection usually comes through charges. If the original call doesn't give you a clean charge, you reach for the ones that are easiest to claim after the fact. That's exactly where this headed. After the takedown, officers started talking through potential charges in a way that wasn't tied to the neighbor dispute itself. The focus shifted to behavior-based accusations that can be stacked around any tense encounter: resisting, disorderly conduct, failure to identify. The kind of labels that sound legitimate on paper but often function as cover when the original reason for contact falls apart. Jack kept recording and kept pointing out the problem. He watched officers treat his father as a threat, while also admitting on camera that they didn't have evidence of an actual crime matching the high-risk posture they arrived with. Jack also continued to complain about how officers handled him, including the close physical positioning and contact while ordering him away. Then came the moment that turned this from a troubling incident into a documented scandal. Bodycam footage later captured officers privately discussing how to make charges stick, not discussing evidence, not discussing witness statements, not discussing a clear crime connected to the original call. Discussing strategy, discussing how to frame it, discussing how to push pressure points, including juvenile court leverage, as if the goal was to produce consequences that justified what they had already done. And the reason that mattered wasn't just optics, it showed intent. It showed that at least some officers understood the gap between what the call was and how they responded. And instead of correcting course, they moved toward creating a legal story that supported force after the fact. By the time the scene settled, Michael had been forcibly detained. Jack had been treated like an obstacle in his own home. And the entire incident had shifted away from a neighbor dispute into something much bigger, a question of warrantless entry, unnecessary force, and charge stacking talk captured on Bodycam. Once the footage started circulating, the story stopped being a private neighborhood call and became a public example of what happens when a false weapon claim triggers a high-risk response and officers refuse to de-escalate. The first wave of reaction focused on the basics people could see without legal training. This started as a neighbor dispute involving a teenager on a gas-powered bicycle, but officers arrived treating it like an armed threat. Then they pushed into the home without a warrant, used force on the father, and treated the kid filming like a problem. The second wave focused on what made it worse. The officers' own cameras captured them, admitting they didn't have clear evidence of an actual underlying crime tied to Michael in that moment. That meant the public wasn't debating opinions. They were reacting to contradictions. And then the body cam discussion about charges hit. That piece changed the conversation from bad judgment to intentional cover, because the footage showed officers privately discussing how to make charges stick after the fact, including tossing around common add-on charges like resisting and disorderly conduct, and talking about pressure through juvenile court. They weren't talking about a proven offense that happened before police arrived. They were talking about building a legal justification for the force and entry that had already happened. That's why the legal side didn't just fade away. When the case reached prosecutors, the response was not a full endorsement of what the officers did. Parts of the case were declined or reduced, but it didn't cleanly disappear either. Misdemeanor charges lingered and moved toward a trial schedule, which is its own kind of punishment, even when the case is weak. It means court dates, legal fees, stress, and the constant risk that a system will reward the narrative of compliance over the reality of what happened. For the Franek family, that meant the incident didn't end when the officers left. It stayed in their lives as a legal process they didn't ask for. At the same time, the department had to deal with the fact that the most damaging parts were on their own cameras. An internal investigation eventually found policy violations. That matters because departments don't always admit that on the record unless the documentation is strong. In this case, the record wasn't just a complaint. It was video, including the private discussion about charges. Corrective actions were assigned, and later, 2 officers were fired for failing to complete the required corrective steps. That outcome wasn't framed as a dramatic admission of wrongdoing. It was the kind of accountability that happens through paperwork and policy, slow, quiet, and often narrower than what the public expects. But it still mattered because it confirmed officially that the response did not meet standards. The family didn't treat that as good enough. They filed a civil rights lawsuit seeking damages and an apology. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about putting the department under a different kind of pressure, one that requires sworn statements, discovery, depositions, and a real explanation for why officers entered a home without a warrant, and then discussed charge strategies after admitting they lacked evidence of an underlying offense. That's the accountability path people don't see on social media. Viral clips create attention. Lawsuits create consequences. And Jack's role in that mattered more than people realized at first. His recording wasn't just a teenager being defiant. It was the reason the timeline stayed intact. It prevented the incident from being simplified into a report that said, "Subject resisted," and left it there. It gave the public and investigators something solid to compare against the official narrative. By the time this moved toward trial scheduling and civil litigation, the neighbor dispute was almost irrelevant. The real issue was how easily a false claim can turn police into a high-risk entry team, and how quickly some officers will shift into charge stacking mode when the original reason for the call doesn't support the level of force they used. Here's the part viewers should sit with. If the weapon in the waistband claim had never been made, this likely stays a complaint and a conversation. If Jack hadn't recorded, it likely becomes a report about non-compliance. If Bodycam hadn't captured the private charge talk, The department could have framed it as confusion and moved on. That's how ridiculous becomes dangerous. When the system has the power to turn a thin story into a serious encounter and then write the official ending. So ask yourself, if you were Michael, would you have tried to slow it down and demand names and badge numbers? Or would you have said as little as possible and tried to end it fast? And if you were Jack, would you have recorded, even with officers trying to push you back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever seen a situation escalate because someone made a claim that officers treated like fact, share that too. And if you want more story times like this, realistic, modern, and focused on accountability, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.